Something that seems to be a modern trend that I and many others have noticed is the prospect of a self-insert character. For those unfamiliar with the concept, a self-insert is a character who, rather than being unique or properly contextualized participant in the story, instead serves as a surrogate for the writer. They embody a disproportionate amount of the characteristics and traits of their creator, identify with the same politics, ideology, or ideas, and behave exactly as they would behave, only in a more positive, moralistic, and pronounced way. On top of all of that, the creator tends to remove any negative traits they may have to serve their own ego, and the result is a character who would be insufferable in the real world, but that is universally liked in-world, and has the narrative constructed around them to such an extent that the writing will bend over backwards with contrivances to allow this character to exist and face little to no consequences for their actions. As you might be able to tell, I'm not a massive fan of this new trend, but I want to more fundamentally examine why this is a problem, and why you need to avoid doing this in your own story. More than that, I do want to look at ways that you can integrate parts of your own personality and experiences into your creation, without it being cheap, or looking like your ego has inflated to astronomical proportions. Well, I've already mentioned in brief why these characters are an issue, but to be honest, they are all rather superfluous reasons, and the biggest reasons are actually deeper and simpler. The real reasons these characters are a problem is twofold. It isn't balanced, and it's lazy. A good character in any book is a combination of positive and negative attributes, strengths and weaknesses, established skills, and areas left wanting. In order to successfully insert a character that is balanced and realistic, based on yourself, requires an enormous amount of introspection, self-reflection, and brutal honesty that is usually only reserved for Buddhist monks. If you believe that you are capable of being completely honest about who you are, can state your strengths truthfully without overinflation rather than making them what you want them to be, that you can represent your weaknesses fairly without excusing them away, and can account for each and every facet of your life, well, then you may be able to pull off the trick. The point is that not many people can honestly represent themselves on paper without slipping into fantasizing and exacerbation. The balance required in a character, where they suffer, sacrifice, are hated and disliked, attacked and flawed in many aspects, is much harder to achieve when you're dealing with yourself. Most people aren't ready to be that honest with themselves, and the sacrifices they must make to realize their dream self. This is why psychologists and therapists exist in great numbers, and why self-help books are eternally popular. Because most of us need help to be honest with ourselves. There is a certain arrogance with portraying oneself on paper as a separate character, but one who inhabits all the wonderful things that make you you, while ignoring all the problematic parts. There is a strong likelihood that you will compensate for all your real-world deficiencies by making your in-fiction self all-powerful. This is why we like video games. They allow us to be perfect and unstoppable, but they rarely lead us to make balanced characters if we're given total control over the character's personality and abilities. It's why Skyrim turns into a power fantasy by the end, and Ghost of Tsushima doesn't. As for the lazy side of things, well, it simply is lazy to chuck down the superhero version of yourself on paper, rather than go through the work of creating a character that is contextually relevant, complex, flawed, integrated into the world, and able to be critically evaluated by the author and others. By having real characters, you as the author are forced to put in more work to develop them, to write their traits in more detail. You are less likely to forget key characteristics that you assume of yourself, and you will be better able to more objectively evaluate them within the narrative without the bias attached to your own character. This will give you a much greater sense of achievement, as it allows you to more honestly develop them, as well as avoiding the trap of dictating to your audience how they should feel about your character. A theme I've noticed in lots of modern Hollywood writers is that the creators become very defensive when characters are criticized as shallow or underdeveloped. This strikes me as the writers feeling personally attacked, rather than having a rational reaction to critique. This is almost certainly a consequence of them inserting too much of themselves, their beliefs, or their ideals into the character, and then they aren't able to respond objectively. Having insert characters makes it much harder for you to evaluate your work, receive honest feedback, and improve your skill as a writer. If you are serious about improving and understand that you're still developing as an author, then you need to give yourself the space to grow, to learn from others, and to detach yourself somewhat from the elements you've created. Putting yourself on paper, or a personified version of your deepest held beliefs into the story, makes this much harder, and makes you far more likely to become complacent about improving your skills. So, how can we do this? Haruki Murakami is a great example of an author inserting themselves into their own narrative. What Murakami does so exceptionally well is to include negative or not entirely positive traits of himself into his characters. He does not insert his entire personality, but instead imbues many of his characters with a sense of introvertedness and introspection that he also feels. He makes a core part of his character's journey about finding meaning in their lives. This is something that Murakami has spoken about before, and it is a good example of how you can insert part of yourself into the story. It is much more immersive to introduce negative parts of your own character into a creation, as J.K. Rowling does with Harry Potter and his sense of abandonment and loneliness that she experienced. Or how Hemingway's Jake Barnes shares the author's experience of war and injury, and how Sylvia Plath's Esther Greenwood demonstrates much of the battle that Plath herself had with mental illness, depression, and suicide. You should avoid making any insert character amazing and fantastic and instantly likable. Instead, use your experience of something negative to mold a new character and have us follow their journey against adversity or their recovery from said trauma. I should be clear. You are not inserting your ideology or particular viewpoint or any perceived adversity you may or may not have had, but negative characteristics and traits that you do have, that you must have because nobody is perfect. This requires honesty, and if you're not up to that, then don't insert yourself into the story. However, the level of honesty needed to put in some negative elements is less than putting an entire, true representation of yourself into the narrative. Just taking a piece, with a focus on the negatives, forces you to be more honest, but can also allow you to make a character that you can understand and empathize with. Another way to insert characters is to have them as secondary or tertiary members of the cast who will have minor impacts on the story. This can be a way for you to vent your desire to be included without taking focus away from the main characters. Again, this requires a degree of honesty. George R.R. Martin has said that Samwell Tarly very closely resembles himself with his size, fears, and bookish nature. Martin understands who he is, and introduces an honest enough reflection of himself as a side character. Notice that this is not a negative, downbeaten character, but one who is realistically flawed and contextually accurate within the world. Authors such as Martin avoid making their self-insert the focal point of the story, at the expense of other characters. This in turn creates a more balanced and immersive narrative with characters who are allowed to grow naturally apart from the author's vision. In my own story, the character of George is very much an insert for myself, but I've made sure to relegate him to sidekick, to not overinflate his importance, and to definitely not let any of my worldview into that story. George serves to support the main protagonist as her confidant and companion, not to overshadow her with my ego. This has been a challenge, but also a positive, humbling, and self-reflective exercise. The main character, however, is a self-insert of my grandma, but this is more acceptable, as I can be more objective with how I portray her, and have taken steps to make sure my own philosophy does not overtake her own as I write. This is why I have conducted hours upon hours of interviews with her, to learn as much as I can, so that I can represent her fairly and honestly. This is the other point of insert characters. They don't have to be yourself. They can be other people that you know, or whose work you are more intimately aware of. There is obviously a risk here, because you need to make sure you portray or insert them appropriately and fairly, or be prepared to face the backlash. Like when you imagine yourself, it's important to make sure that you're not fantasizing or extrapolating pre-existing beliefs that you have about them. If you're going to include other people, make sure it's based on interviews where you can deep dive into their beliefs, experience, and views, or make sure you engross yourself in the books or content seriously, rather than basing it off soundbites on TikTok. You need to detach your presuppositions, positive and negative, from your portrayal of this figure, not only because you hopefully want to produce something honest, but also for the integrity of your own story and your reputation. Take care not to manipulate their views or beliefs, especially if they are not aligned with your own. It can be very tempting to idolize or demonize people based on their views and use that temptation to write a story that allows you to vent at them from the safety of your keyboard. But this very rarely produces something that will stand the test of time. It's an emotional rather than a creative outburst, and should be reserved for therapy rather than literature. The final point, and one that reflects all of the characteristics we've discussed in this series, is that your self-insert, or any character for that matter, needs to be developed properly. They need to sacrifice, suffer, be weak, face challenges, and be clearly motivated. If you're going to insert them, make a significant effort to develop them as you would any other fully formed character in a book. This avoids the common problem of self-inserts being flat and one-dimensional characters who fail to engage the reader, or simply take to preaching the writer's particular worldview. Taking into consideration all the necessary ingredients for strong characters allows you to build fully formed, detailed, and rich actors who make your story far more interesting. Do the work to critically evaluate the characters. Go through the necessary steps for them to grow and change. The only thing here that you will notice is that soon enough they'll stop resembling you, if you've done it properly. And that leads to the most important point. If you don't self-insert, or insert anybody else for that matter, you don't have to deal with any of these problems. It is much easier to simply not put yourself or anyone else in the story at all, and realize that doing so very rarely will improve the story. If you're using your experiences, extract those, honestly and in isolation, and put them into a new character who is not you. Typically, we are not writing stories for personal wish fulfillment, or self-aggrandizement, or to make idealized versions of ourselves. The theme throughout this video has been honesty. Look at your intentions, your flaws and capabilities, and be honest. Truly, really be honest about whether you need to have a version of yourself here, and whether you can accurately portray others too. You may think highly of yourself, but there will be people who don't. We don't all agree on every issue, and expecting that is the height of arrogance. Be humble, be honest, be hardworking to make a character who is interesting for any reader, not just for you and whoever agrees with you. And remember that regardless of viewpoint, ideology, creed, religion, political affiliation, ethnicity, culture, sex, gender, or any other category you wish to put yourself into, we are hopefully writing to produce beautiful stories that inspire and entertain by providing the world with angelic music rather than the sound of us blowing our own trumpets.